Okay, so last time I filmed an INFJ video, the comments were incredibly polarized. You might not, if you go back, you might be able to see it because I will have like moderated, rude comments or whatever. But you got the very FE heavy INFJs that are like so affirming and is so nice or whatever. And then you get the very TI heavy INFJs. And so I get like a paragraph of like this pedantry pretty much of all these very specific details that weren't quite right or whatever. So then I get all, I get like PTSD, make sure I'm detail oriented. Okay, here we go. So in this video today, I want to go over this matrix here, this overused, underused, strength, weakness matrix that I've been going over for all the types. And today it's the INFJ. So we're going to go through your functions, your strengths, and your weaknesses. So I think it should be a good time. Okay, so if you haven't heard of cognitive functions, it's going to be really important to this video. So Myers Briggs actually came after what Carl Jung coined in 1921, which are the cognitive functions. So these are the 8 cognitive functions here. So all 16 of the personality types use all 8 of these cognitive functions in a specific order, specific ways, which give them a specific flavor. So if I get too far into this and maybe it's not resonating, it could be just that you're mistyped. The online tests are very frequently unreliable. I know people who it tested them correctly. I know some people who it didn't test them correctly, or they were this type and they tested this type. And so it's incredibly unreliable. So I wouldn't get too attached to whatever result you got in an online test. Specifically INFJ, that's an incredibly, this is a huge mistyped type in particular. The test will really skew in this direction in particular. So yeah, I just recommend people learn about the cognitive functions and then type themselves in that way. So for the INFJ, this is the order they use these cognitive functions. So I have the images listed as well as the cognitive function and their abbreviation listed here. So loosely speaking, this is descending in order of importance to the INFJ. So first and foremost, they prioritize introverted intuition, then extraverted feeling, and so on down the line. And also loosely speaking, this is descending in chronological order at which this gets developed within the personality type. So, as a young child, you should see evidence of yourself using that introverted intuition. Then maybe teens, 20s, that second function comes on the scene. 30s, that function becomes more of a strength. 40s, that fourth function becomes more of a strength, and kind of so on down the line. So to add a little bit more nuance to this, your top 4 functions are conscious to you and you value them. Your bottom 4 functions are not valued by you and not conscious to you. So in those bottom 4 functions, that's where a lot of biases can come up because you just don't value those things. You don't value them in yourself or in other people. In those top 4 functions, even 3 and 4, which don't tend to, as a default, be the strength, because you value those functions in yourself and other people, you might choose a partner who has those traits because it's still something that you value in terms of society, even if you're not currently exhibiting it as a strength. So to add more nuance to this, the functions in green, 1, 2, 5, and 6 are your potential strengths, and your functions in red, 3, 4, 7, and 8 are your probable weaknesses. Now, this isn't the case for 100% of people, and especially the older you get, the more likely some of these are going to be flipped. But if you're in your 20s, let's say, there's every likelihood that these red ones are red. So by the time you're 16, these should be all kind of working in the default way. And then as time goes on, certain functions will kind of come up and start to take a little bit more of a priority than they had at first. But this is kind of, by the time you're 16, this is kind of the default of how things are working. So this is that matrix that I was talking about earlier. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to really dive deep into the top 4 functions because there's so much meat to unpack in the functions that are conscious and valued. So I'm really just going to zoom in on those. In your first functions, your overused strength, and so on down the list. Your fourth functions, your underused weakness. And I really want to zoom in on how this colors the INFJ personality specifically. So if you want to know where I got some of this information, these bullet points here are quotes from Carl Jung, John Beebe, and Myers Briggs from a previous video I did where I kind of deeply went into the text, and then at the end of that video I summarized it in bullet points here. So because that other video, I'm not going to go into it deeply here, but if you want to pause it and see where do I get some of this information, you can take a look at this slide. Okay, so getting into your first cognitive function, introverted intuition. This function is your overused strength. As your first function, everyone's first function is. This is who you feel like you are. This is the water you swim in. Carl Jung talks about that dominant function basically never stagnates. It's the thing that you're compelled to do in every area of life. If you're at work and you're at home and you're doing this, you're always doing this thing. This is the function that's been with you the longest since you were a young child. You should see evidence of yourself as a young child using this function. So this is who you feel like you are. This is your number 1 strength. So this is introverted intuition, and introvert means to turn inward, because vert means to turn, intro means inward. And Carl Jung got the words introvert and extrovert. He coined those words, but he got them from Benet's words introspection and externospection. So the only difference between introvert and introspection is that spect. So it's to watch over. So if you're introverting, You're turning inward and you're watching what's happening inwardly. So this is not related to alone time or people time. It's certainly easier to introvert, to kind of introspect when you're alone, but you could be in a group of people and you could tune them all out and you could tune in to your own introspection. So it's not necessarily watching Netflix, because if you're at home watching Netflix, you're turning outward toward the screen. So that might technically be called extroverting. So I always want to clarify that definition, because introversion and extroversion have had a lot of different definitions attached to them over time. And there's a lot of things you could turn inward toward. It could be, your thoughts, your feelings, your senses. But in this case, it's turning inward toward the intuitions. And intuition is the opposite of sensing. So sensing is, what exists and what you have experienced or you are experiencing in reality. So the opposite of that is what does not exist. You're kind of experiencing what does not exist. So this could be the future, a vision within your mind. This could be what's not being said, reading between the lines, an idea. So these are things not currently in existence, and you're processing these things that are not currently in existence, which is very different from introverted sensing, which also does a lot of deep processing, but it does an in-depth processing of what has exist, like a deep processing of the memories, for example, or a deep processing of the day, or making meaning from the day. So I just did a series where I went through Carl Jung's writing and kind of, parsed through, helping people kind of summarize what does some of this language mean. And the number one word used by Carl Jung for introverted intuition was the word vision, or image comes up a lot as well, but vision is the most common one. And there's a quote about introverted intuition chases the vision deeper and deeper to get deeper meaning. And again, it's this vision that hasn't existed. So it's not a memory or anything that you have experienced, but it's a lot of times there's a lot of futuristic quotes, which I'll get to, but like this picture on the bottom right, where it's this person getting deeper and deeper, following this vision deeper and deeper down this path. So it's internally seeing what doesn't exist. So this could be the vision, internal connections, insight, purpose. These are things that do not sensorily exist. And there's a lot of overlap between words. So like meaning is a word that comes up in the introverted intuition section, but it also comes up in the introverted sensing section. So there's a common misunderstanding that like introverted intuition is like the deep wise function, but that causes a lot of mistype between introverted sensors and introverted intuitive. So I want to make sure that I value introverted sensing as well. That there's a lot of wisdom in introverted sensing, and they seem kind of wise beyond their years and seeing timeless things. Introverted intuition, there's a quote that it feels compelled to transform the vision into its own life. So there were quotes about seeing the course of things, or the clear outline of things, or the way they want to go, or the right direction or the wrong direction to go. It feels like, similar to this path image here, it feels like you have this one life purpose, that this vision was just kind of given to you, and anything else feels wrong. They talked about that the communication style has a lot of symbols, paradox, and so the communication style is very approximating and vague. So these images here, they're kind of approximating and vague. Even to just describe it, it's like, the seeing eye or the yin-yang symbol. It's these symbols that mean a certain thing, and all they can do is approximate what they're getting at. So there were quotes about prophetic prevision, or feeling at home in spiritual things, and it definitely has this futuristic flavor. So I want to give a caveat. When I get to the extroverted sensing, I'll talk about it a little bit more, but there were quotes about how it sees this prophetic prevision, like this, this path here, this future path that it needs to go down, but it's not always right. It perceives the ideal inner life in general, and a lot of times this comes down to purpose. You'll hear introverted intuitives speaking a lot about the purpose, about the future, insights between things, a lot of communication like that. So I have a few images here of how it could manifest. It might not. But an example, I did put astrology here because it does, depending on how people use astrology, it can come down to a prevision, like telling the future. Some people use astrology in that way, and then some people use it in a very spiritual way. It's not proven in a sensory way. This is a very non-existent type thing to engage in. So I'll see introverted intuitive, some examples of things this could be is like life path numbers, mysticism, astrology. Introverted intuition has an interest in the archetypes, so any type of grouping people by patterns, it tends to have more of an interest in, Enneagram, personality theory, things like that, where you're grouping people into archetypes, because there is a heavy emphasis in Carl Jung's writing about archetypes with introverted intuition as well. So this is who you feel like you are. It's your number one strength. So a lot of times if people are feeling kind of down or depressed, it's because they haven't made enough space for this first function to thrive. And I think with introverted intuition in particular, it's hard to how do you find a way to make space for this function in your everyday life? There's something very aloof about it. There's something, very different about this function. How do you make space for it? So it's important to be with people who value this function and to, make space for it yourself, because I think a lot of people are not going to make space for this function, so you kind of have to make space for it yourself. So Carl Jung talked about that introversion gives you access to yourself and reflection. So this is why introversion is not just like watching Netflix with your cat, because you don't know yourself deeper, after necessarily watching Netflix with your cat, and you're not necessarily reflecting when you're watching Netflix. I mean, you could be, but it's not necessitated by definition. So this function gives you access to the self and reflection. And your second function gives you access to the world and action taking. So extroversion does not necessarily, by definition, mean being around a bunch of people. It's an orientation toward the world, which could include people. It depends on the function, but it's not limited to people. So extrovert means to turn outward and to watch what's happening outwardly. And there's a lot of things you could be watching what's happening outwardly. You could look at logistics. You could look at people and their feelings. You could look at sensory things. There's a lot of things you could be looking outwardly at. But in this case, it's the feeling. So turning outward and watching the feeling environment. Are we in harmony? Do we have good rapport? Does anyone need anything? Are there any needs that need to be met? Is there any way that we could make the vibe a little bit more positive? How can we all jive together? Kind of meet everyone's needs. So everyone's second function is their underused strength. This is a function that tends to be neglected. And the reason it tends to be neglected is because you're an introvert. So you have a priority for, access to the self and reflection. And this is an extroverted function, which is about the world and action taking. So it's not your preference to spend time in the world action taking, but it's so important to have both. And the reason is that you're an INFJ. So if you want to, neglect this function because you don't like the extroversion of it, you also neglect the feeling aspect of it. You're an INFJ. So this is a huge part of who you are. And this is a function that maybe you're born with a talent in it, but you haven't developed the skill. So it kind of takes some work and some responsibility to get good at it, but you really have the capacity to get good at this function. Your second function is the one that comes on the scene when you're maybe like 16, teens, 20s or so, and it becomes more of a priority in your 20s, this function in general. And Carl Jung talks about the second function adds complexity to the type. At first you're just that one function with access to the self and reflection, introverted intuition. But then this function comes on the scene and you add some complexity, some multidimensionality. It's not a flat character, but it's someone who can engage in the world and also in reflection. So a lot of people can tend to confine their second function to a very small aspect of life. Like I'll use FE if I'm at a party, but I'm not going to use it any other way. So I'm not going to use it at work, or I won't use it in recreation, or, different areas of life you could confine it to. But, to let this function seep out into all areas of life, similar to how your first function never stagnates, allow this one to reach more areas of your life. And there's also a tendency to do this function, like when you do get into this function, to kind of water it down and do it in the most introverted way you possibly can. So it's not really the full life, the full expansiveness of the function. It's kind of like a more introverted version of the function. So the number one word used by Carl Jung for this function is harmony. And the number one goal for FE users is the creation and formation of harmonious relationships. It talks about they have fine shades of expression in big ways and small ways. So there's different ways that they impact the environment and make it more harmonious. So something that FE DOMs do is it's very initiating, it's very proactive. Whereas sometimes when it's a second function, it's kind of like reactive or it's kind of watered down. And so as opposed to initiating the harmonious relationships, initiating the party, initiating kind of the smile or the hug or whatever, they'll kind of just do things that won't step on anyone's toes. They won't harm the environment anyway. They won't necessarily create a harmonious environment, but they're also not going to create a disharmonious environment. So they almost become kind of a quiet, neutral figure as opposed to maybe a proactively creating a very harmonious space. So an action step could be, host more dinner parties or host more guests or anything where you can create harmony between a group of people. Their quotes about extroverted feeling really only sees himself when reflected in his relationships and their opinion of himself. And so it's FE as well as TE are very outcome oriented. So they're flexible on what the process is, as long as it gets the outcome they want. So for extroverted feeling, the outcome that it wants is this harmonious relationship. And so they'll adapt their methods. So if they get bad feedback that this isn't working for the group, they'll adapt it. They basically say that my success is reflected in how you think it is, because I want it to be a harmonious environment. So if my goal is for it to be harmonious and you didn't find it harmonious, then I'm going to change the process. So, really a good measure of how good your FE is how are other people seeing you in your relationships and their opinion of you. Extrovert feeling, there's a lot of quotes about them being welcoming, warmth, creating an atmosphere. So some things I see a lot of FE DOMs doing that I think INFJs could lean more into, making food for people. Food is a very welcoming thing that brings a lot of harmony to a group. Smiles, very, universally welcoming. Hugs, creating a conversation flow. I think, a proactivity to a facilitation of a conversation. Charm, I think a lot of times FE DOMs are very charming. So getting really good at, a certain body language. Extroverted feeling knows exactly what's tactful, what's accommodating, what's appropriate for the moment. So it really is adjusting depending on the environment. But extroverted feeling says, I want this environment to be a certain way, and what works in one environment doesn't work in another environment. So I'm going to figure out, kind of like a puzzle, and figure out what do I need to do to make us all jive together. And so there are quotes about extroverted feeling can read the feelings of another person and adjust them. And it can be a small indication, the smallest indication of body language. And then they're adjusting what they're doing. Sometimes FE second is just kind of a passive character. It's like they'll notice something's off with a person, but instead of taking a proactive stance to really change it, they're just kind of like, I'll get quieter. I won't do something to make them mad. I don't want to hurt their feelings. Or it becomes kind of this, I won't do this because I don't want to make them mad, as opposed to, I will do this to create the harmonious environment. So this could be, an example of some things I thought of, but it's not limited to. It could be, you notice someone's left out. Another thing is to include yourself in this. If you notice that you are feeling left out, or if you notice that your feelings aren't being valued, take action, immediately, adjust quickly. So don't just accommodate for others, but also accommodate for yourself. So I think when this function is used in a passive way or a watered down way, it can be kind of anxious. It can be kind of, this is a lot of work. I don't want to hurt this person's feelings. And, it becomes very stressful when you use this function in a passive way. And I think, I hear from INFJs that they don't want to get into this FE because it just feels like it's a lot of work. But actually, when you use this function in a proactive way, you're setting the tone, as opposed to the tone gets set and then you have to just kind of fill in the holes and meet everyone's needs. You get to set the tone with your boundaries and your preferences, and then you end up putting in less work when you kind of create the environment. So I recommend that everyone work on their second function for like 5 years. Myers Briggs talk about that if you want to work on a function, you need to isolate it and work on it only for an extended amount of time. So this is the function that out of all the functions, you've got the most bang for your buck because it tends to be neglected. It's also your underused strength. So there's so much room, there's prospect and range they talk about with this function. So this function, John Beebe calls the parent function. And when you think about what a good parent does, it sets expectations for the self, it sets expectations for the child, and it's a way that you can be responsible. It's a way you can be a mature individual. There's a lot of maturity in a good parent. So that's something that this function really gives to you. So this function lends a lot of satisfaction. I've heard from a lot of different individuals that when they came back to their second function, they felt so much satisfaction, like they were coming home to themselves, because you're an INFJ. So to get rid of this function gets rid of a huge part of who you are. And this is the function where you end up being able to mentor people really well and teach people really well, because your first function is just kind of a natural talent. And so it's kind of hard to teach people something that you're a natural at. But your second function, you're very skilled at it, or you have a potential to be very skilled at it, which makes you a good teacher. But also you had to earn it and work for it. So you could see what's difficult about this function, what's the right way to engage with it, what's the wrong way to engage with it. And then you can really teach people that thing because you actually overcame the pitfalls of this function. You can show people what's the correct way to do relationships, the correct way to set boundaries or not enough boundaries, or people walked all over you, or then your boundaries were too strict. Or, I hear a lot about ways to communicate with people from IFJs and things that they learned over time about how to use this function. So your third function is Introverted Thinking. So everyone's third function is the direct opposite of their second function. So since your second function is extroverted, this one's introverted. Since your second function is feeling, the opposite of feeling is thinking. So introverted thinking is the direct opposite. So everyone's third function is their overused weakness. Now, the reason it's overused is because you're an introvert, that access to the self and reflection. So there's a tendency to overindulge in the realm of the self and the reflection and ruminating on things. But it's kind of like dessert. It's too overindulgent. It's too much of that thing because it cuts off access to the world and action taking. And the real issue with it is that because these two functions are direct opposites, FE and TI, they're called a polarity. So it's kind of like the North Pole and the South Pole. FE is the North Pole, TI is the South Pole. And you can't be at the North Pole and the South Pole at the same time. You have to pick one. Or it's kind of like a light switch. The light switch is either flipped on to FE or it's flipped down to TI. But for every second you choose TI, you're neglecting FE, which is who you really are. You're an INFJ, not an INTJ. So to go into TI means you have to neglect who you really are. And John Beebe calls this third function the child function. There's a lot of quotes about how it's childish. There's a lot of cowardice. Carl talks about the dangers of one-sidedness with too introverted or too extroverted. And if you get too into the self and that rumination and reflection, he talks about there's a lot of times there's cowardice there. It could be insecurity, it could be ego, there's a lot of different things that live in this third function. And it's just like a bratty teenager. So a lot of times people will go to this function if they're in an argument, conflict, if they're insecure or defensive. It's typically not in a good time that people go to this function, although it's not exclusively used in a bad way, but that definitely is the overwhelming tendency. So this function is introverted thinking. So introvert means to turn inward again, access to the self and reflection. But in this case, what it's turning inward toward are the thoughts. How do I think about things? Does this make sense to me? It can be kind of skeptical, kind of an emphasis on truth, principles. So the number one word used for introverted thinking is principles. And in TI DOMs in particular, it makes a very principled individual. So I have an arrow here. Once a function gets in this third spot, you might take a strength of the function and gets twisted, or you take a negative trait of the function, because all the functions have positive and negative traits. So in this case, it can be pedantic, which, in case you didn't know what that was, I put the definition here. Obsessively concerned with minor details. This could be in language, really correcting others' language. And one thing that happens with the FE types is that I begin to notice more of a difference in gender than I do with some of the other types. So like with FI, I don't notice as much, but with FE types, because they're aware of what's appropriate in our current social sphere and kind of bending themselves to what's appropriate at the time, I will notice a big difference in gender between female IFJs and male IFJs. So for female INFJs, I tend to notice that the TI that they have usually just exhibits itself in a shy nature. I think that culture has really encouraged women to be an FE, but also in a kind of not necessarily in a leadership way or in a proactive way. So I notice a tendency for female INFJs to just be relatively shy. And it's not typically this critical type of TI, but it's a lot of maybe the social awkwardness or shyness with TI. With the male INFJs, I think society has a lot more encouraged men to be more in a logical space, to have, more of these thinking conversations. It really hasn't encouraged men to go to, etiquette or what's appropriate or things that can be associated with FE. So I've had comments from male INFJs that they talked about getting into FE was the best thing that they ever did, and they felt that they weren't encouraged to get into FE and to get out of TI. They felt like they were very encouraged to get into TI, which is not a strength for them. And so I just feel so bad for all the types who are not encouraged to be their true selves. I think that is such a hard thing to have to deal with. So yeah, all that to say is that some of these TI bullet points are not going to apply to everyone because everyone's had diverse experiences which are going to shape them in particular ways. These are just some patterns that I see with some types. And a lot of times this can be a lot of critical self-talk. I've got this image in the bottom left of this person really criticizing themselves. I mean, that critical nature gets applied to themselves even more heavily than it does externally. And the way that they describe to me their critical self-talk, I mean, it's excessive. And so, going back up into that FE, that accommodating nature, that warmth nature, apply that to yourself as well. Take your own feelings into consideration as well and tend to your own feelings as well. One of the negative quotes about introverted thinking is that it appears cold, inaccessible, taciturn, timid, can have antisocial prejudices. So, TI is the direct opposite of FE. And so when it's in this third position, you tend to get a lot more of the negative traits of the function. But extroverted feeling is incredibly warm and welcoming and creating the atmosphere. So the opposite of that warmth is this coldness, inaccessible, taciturn. When you only have access to the self, that's incredibly, taciturn. I've known IFJs who described to me that they actually have a lot of social anxiety. They feel kind of timid or anxious in a social setting. Some don't. It depends on how much that ratio of TI-FE is balanced out. But FE has an adeptness with social interaction. It really knows how to, navigate a room, which is very different from TI. Introverted thinking can be critical. Now, introverted thinking, when it's a strength, like when it's the first function, it's skeptical and it has a critique of knowledge in general. I wouldn't call it critical. Like a lot of times when you use the word critical, you're saying that person's really critical. Like they criticize you a lot. And TI is just a critique of knowledge in general. Like, let's critique this thought system. system. But sometimes when you get in this third position, because this is an INFJ and they're very people-oriented, that criticism gets oriented toward people, criticizing the person. That could be the self, others. This could be drama. A lot of times an improper blend of FETI. So I notice with the IFJs and the ETPs, they can both have kind of drama issues because any of those 4 types don't have FETI in the first position. So that can be drama. This next quote is kind of funny. So introverted thinking, these are quotes from Carl Jung, which is so funny. There were quotes about introverted thinking, feeling gauche or awkward, having a vague dread of the opposite sex, feeling anxious, like it was talking about specifically like in a dating situation. So sometimes it can be kind of like unsure of the self, kind of that criticism or, one thing I've already talked about in all the videos I've talked about that I think the third function is what lends people to being like involuntarily single. So if you're single and you don't want to be, a lot of times because you want a mature person, you want to be a mature person, and this third function is what lends all this immaturity, this bratty teenagerness, and people don't want to be in a relationship with a bratty teenager, And now, in addition to that, you already have a function, introverted thinking, which when it's in the third spot becomes this kind of like awkward, unsure about the dating world, and then I've already talked about this involuntarily single thing. So it's kind of a double dose of that thing. So you got, double motivation to get back up into extroverted feeling, which extroverted feeling is incredibly good with the people environment. I'm really good with the dating world, I would say. And the final quote with introverted thinking from Carl Jung is that it can be haughty and have a flavor of superiority. Now, I believe Carl Jung is a TI user himself. So this is a TI user saying this about his own group. And there was a quote from Carl Jung that their inner logical reasoning makes them feel like they're right, which I thought was so fascinating because he specifically used the word feel, even though it's a logical function. And so especially, when you think about bratty teenagers, they really feel like they're right, but just because there's this big conviction about feeling like they're right doesn't necessarily mean that they are. So, it's important to get into extroverted feeling, which allows you to see, how are people how am I being received by people? And that needs to be the final stop. Do people like this behavior or do they not? And if a lot of people are, giving me the messaging that I'm coming off as egotistical, I don't think I'm egotistical, but I'm getting the messaging from a lot of people that they think I'm egotistical, I need to do something and change something in my behavior to make that change. And that's not the case for all INFJs. Some INFJs, that critical nature stays within themselves. Some INFJs, you don't see it very much externally, but maybe online you see it. So it really, there's a lot of variance for how this could show up. So what's so important for everyone is to allow your second function, the parent, to parent your third function, the child. An appropriate parent-child dynamic, there's a subordination that the third function needs to subordinate itself to the parent. So, just like children, teenagers are not all bad, not by any stretch of the imagination, not even close to all bad. But you don't let them drive the car. So you allow its value for the appropriate time. Children are really good, in time of like recreation or whatever, play. Introverted thinking, you give me an interest in logic and in a fun way, maybe I'll play with logic and principles. But extroverted feeling will parent TI and say, we're not going to use you if you're going to be critical and break harmony. Harmony and FE is the number one thing. That's kind of the number one goal. So if a TI is going to break that FE harmony, then you got to do it in a different way. I see a lot of these things down here you don't see with TI DOMs, but you see it a little bit more with TI thirds. So your fourth function is extroverted sensing, and everyone's fourth function is the direct opposite of that first one. Since your first one is introverted, this one's extroverted. Since your first function is intuition, the opposite of intuition is sensing. So extroverted sensing is your fourth function. And everyone's fourth function is their underused weakness. Your first one's your overused strength, so the opposite of that is an underused weakness. So your third function is a weakness because you overuse it and tend to do it too much. This one is a weakness because it's underused, and John Beebe calls this your inferiority complex. It's something that you feel like you're not good at, you feel like you're inferior at it. And it's true that it's not a strength, but you're also not as bad at it as you feel like you are. There is an element to it of being a complex, an inferiority complex. There's a lot of vulnerability to go to that function. So this first and fourth function, these are a polarity. They're the direct opposites of each other. So just like the second and third function, we got like this light switch situation. So if your first function is your number one strength, it's who you feel like you are, it basically never stagnates. You're using it 95% of the time. That means that light switch is almost always flipped up. And that means that would only leave 5% of the time for it to be switched down to SE, which is kind of a no-brainer because that's what you feel like is your big weakness. But the issue is that people tend to create the belief my first function and my first function only will get me what my first function wants. But this ends up creating a different type of prison for each of the personality types. So for this function, it could be like the vision, and meditating on the vision only will get me this vision. But so much meditating on the vision and reflecting on this vision, that's not actually going to make the vision come to pass. There's some action needed, which is a lot of times this oriented in SE, that's going to require that to need to be happening. So this function is extroverted sensing. So extrovert means to turn outward and watch what's happening outwardly, kind of impacting the external environment. And the things that it's watching outwardly is the sensory environment. So that sight, that sound, that noise, and it really wants to amplify the sensory environment. It wants to impact that sensory environment, make it more lively, more exciting. The number one word used for extroverted sensing was sensation, which I feel like almost shouldn't count, but I accepted it for this one. And there was a quote that for them, life is the accumulation of experience with concrete objects. So that's what's most exciting about life, is all these experiences with concrete objects. Examples that I use sometimes with extroverted sensing is like riding really fast on the freeway with the top down, with music loud, and you've got your friends and you're eating snacks, or you got your coffee or whatever. So it's just this very fun sensory environment. Now for INFJs, the default is that it's incredibly turned off. So it's really important to sprinkle some of this in to get you out of kind of that NI prison. You don't want to become like an SE Dom. You don't want to be like 50-50 NI-SE, but you don't want to be 95-5. So I recommend people kind of getting that more, the ratio more like 80-20. You sprinkle it in, it lets you out of that NI prison that we can tend to create for ourselves and kind of adds more range. So the quote about introverted intuitives is their bodily existence and its effect on others fades from view, and they can be unadapted to actual present day reality. So some things that, this could turn into, it might be good to, your bodily effect on others. Notice your facial expressions. I notice a lot of NI users, they kind of have this flat face, just NI in isolation. Then it takes like FE or some SE to really show how you're feeling. I've heard that people, the communication that people read, people will trust the bodily communication over what's coming out of your mouth. So like TI, for example, that's a very verbal function. It's just the logic of things coming out of your mouth. But people are really tuned into the body language a lot more, which FE and SE will help your communication be received a lot better. Or even aesthetics. I had heard the quote from a personality hacker, this difference between the steak and the sizzle. So there are certain types that they really play up the attractiveness of something, like, ooh, look at this steak, look at how it looks, look at the presentation of it, smell it, you can hear that sizzle, and it really lures people in. It's kind of the advertisement of the thing. And then you bite into it, and it's actually a terrible tasting steak. It was just really focused on the optics and the advertisement of this thing. So for SE users, they can focus too much on the sizzle. And for NI users, they can focus too much on the steak. Here's the meatiness of this thing, the deep meaning of it. But it ends up looking unattractive. The aesthetics are not there. And so people are never drawn in. There's nothing drawing people into it. So it ends up they can kind of lose some influence in that reason. So it's really important to pay attention to the bodily existence, be adapted to everyday present reality. I had heard that they had kind of analyzed some jurors, and jurors are more likely to believe a witness who looks attractive versus someone who doesn't look attractive. And it's something that's one of those stats that, like, I hate that type of thing, but it's something where, extroverted sensing will pay attention to the aesthetics and the sizzle of something. And so if something really is attractive, make it look attractive externally as well. Other quotes about introverted intuition has a lot of obstinacy, stubborn, even in mistaken views. It can be really conceited. And this is just about, introverted intuition feels like it has this path, and anything off the path it doesn't want to do. So it's very stubborn. And so its views might be mistaken, but it's like, no, this is the vision. It's got to be right. And so there were quotes about, instead of adapting themselves, they'll just pick different friends. Like, there's people who disagree with them. They'll just pick different people as opposed to, adapting themselves ever. So extroverted sensing gives some, realism. What's realistic? It's not overly conceited or devaluing itself, but it's realistic. Where am I actually rated? And extroverted sensing is very adaptable. It's like, oh, this could work, or this could work, or this could work. Extroverted feeling as well is very adaptable. So you have these two functions, NI and TI, which are incredibly stubborn. And then you have FE and SE, which are a lot more what's adaptable to what's appropriate, or, just kind of adaptable in general. So these functions give a lot more adaptability. And for SE, what's real is prioritized over conjecture. And sometimes that's the opposite for introverted intuition. It sees its vision and how it thinks things are going to go. Another quote about introverted intuition is they can end up having no development of an outer personality, and they end up having no influence. Whereas extroverted sensing is very different. It's very focused on enjoyment with tangible objects, zest for life. There are quotes about it being charming, about being fun, jolly company. It will recount things in a sensational way. And so it's, it has a lot of outer personality. Sometimes that's my criticism of IFJs in general, is there's no development of an outer personality. Sometimes that FE is just kind of watered down in a way where it doesn't want to step on anyone's toes. But when you just want to when you want to do nothing that'll step on anyone's toes, you kind of rob yourself of your uniqueness and your unique outer personality. And extroverted sensing is a very influential function. So what I've noticed about people's fourth function is that the default is for it to be very absent, especially if you're like earlier than 40s. Because like 40s is when I start to see some of these functions start coming up a little bit more, 30s for TI, 40s for SE. At any age, there's always a tendency to get pulled into that TI. But your 40s is when SE starts coming up to the surface. But before that point, I would say in general, what I tend to see is there's an absence of the fourth function, and then sometimes it'll spike for maybe a couple weeks, or it could be shorter, and then it goes back to being absent. And so that's called a grip when it's happening to you. You're not in control of it. You're not consciously using SE. It's just happening to you. You don't feel like you were consciously calling up SE. And so, that grip can manifest for an INFJ. That can manifest as, like they're not in their body. And all of a sudden, they have a stint of like partying or getting really into makeup or spending a lot of money on sensory, like aesthetic things. All of a sudden we're like, not really in the sensory environment. And then all of a sudden we're getting like ombre hair or painting our nails, or we're gonna have a party, or we're drinking a lot, or I got this onesie party here. As opposed to this, like absent and then spike, it'd be better to just raise it a little bit so that in general, more of the time, like 20% of the time, you're just using your body more. So like working out, or in ways, you're enjoying the sensory environment. Maybe you go to a dance class or something where you can really just enjoy this loud music, but just incorporating it a little bit more into your life so that you don't have these spikes that are happening to you. So one thing that I've said, I kind of got this indirectly from Marie von Franz's book about the fourth function, and it was this realization that you feel like you don't really know someone until you know their fourth function. Like when you first meet someone, you get introduced to maybe like their first or second function, over time their third, but it takes a while to get to know someone's fourth function. And I'm always so grateful when I get introduced to someone's fourth function. Like for example, like this onesie here. It's like a very childlike thing, but you'll see like INJs doing these very like goofy sensory things like that, but you don't see it for a while. So I'm always so grateful when people finally let me in and we go from being acquaintances to then like true friends. Like when I really see that fourth function, I feel like that's when we've really turned a page in knowing someone. I have been so grateful for INFJs. I just had this conversation with this INFJ, and we were talking about my YouTube channel, for example, and we were talking about things that were happening. And he said to me, when you talk about personality, you go like this, and it feels like you get lighter and happier. And when you talk about productivity and that side of your channel, it's like there's this weight that's been put on you. And I had never had anyone say that to me. And that comes partly from this fourth function. It's observing the sensor, it's observing the body. And this is someone, he's probably 50, I would estimate. So this is someone, he's got a little bit more control of all four of these functions, but he's using that FE as well as the SE, because we were having a conversation about the future of my channel, kind of this NI. It was a very NI conversation. And I just felt so seen. That's something that I really love about INFJs, that it feels like they're really looking into your soul, that, by body language cues. And that's something that I've really appreciated, that they've kind of helped me with the future, whereas sometimes I've talked about my channel with other people, they kind of put what they think the channel should be on me. And, you can kind of tell that you're not being listened to. But that wasn't the case with this INFJ. I felt like I was listened to, and he was kind of helping me, find the way in a way that resonated with me. I also had a professor who, she was either an INFJ or an ENFJ. I didn't quite get a read, but still similar functions. And she was probably 50 as well. So she's got, a good use of all these functions. And she had written me a letter of recommendation, and it was the most NFJ letter of recommendation. And she, the whole letter of recommendation was just I could see Alexis getting into higher education or being an administrator. She's someone who really cares about policies in general within education and the systems in general behind education. And I felt very seen. That's another case of me feeling very seen by what she had known about me, because it's not something I had shared. I hadn't shared any of these interests, and at the time I definitely did have interests like that. And so it's just kind of this NIFE, I've paid attention to you, and I've paid attention to the small body language signs, and I'm kind of looking to that future, and this is what I see, where I could see you going. And so I think that there's such a, amazing gift within INFJs. I'm so grateful for the time that they've spent. So if you're interested in any more INFJ videos that I have on my channel, I will have the playlist linked in the description box for all of my INFJ videos, as well as if you want to get started working on FE right now, you could go ahead and leave me a nice comment in the comments. No, I'm just kidding. You don't have to do that. But actually, yeah, once I get to the FJ videos, I do appreciate the nice comments, especially, you know, there are some comments where I just feel like they're kind of like reading into my soul or picking up on things that I wasn't like that I didn't even directly say. So I'm always very interested in like the perceptiveness that I get in the INFJ comments sometimes. Also, I do have a membership. If you're interested, I have a membership. You can click join right below this video. I'm going to do a live stream tomorrow. At the time this comes out, it will have already came out, but I'm going to do a live stream about stereotyping versus archetyping. So if you're interested in that type of thing, there's several videos in the membership already. And there's priority access to comments that way as well. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. Bye.